Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Views of an Outsider. Life Should Be Embraced as Sacred, Part 3. Marx's Minions. Marxism has many faces, and all of them have proven deadly. Last week, we went back to the very beginning in order to take a look at the roots of this poisonous tree. We took a long, hard look at what Marx's vision actually produced out in the real world right from day one. Most of the evils of the 20th century can be laid at the feet of this man and the ego that lurked behind his dream. So why haven't we simply gotten rid of him yet? Why do we tolerate the dangerous people who still continue to preach his same old, incredibly destructive message under the new made-up names that they try to hide behind? When are we all going to finally say, enough? I personally believe that day won't arrive until people become so familiar with Marxism that they are able to recognize it, no matter what new form any of its toxic, shape-shifting devotees may try to take. Having looked at the damage that this poisonous ideology produced from the start, results that it has consistently duplicated every time it has been retried somewhere else in the world, an experiment which has been going on for more than a century now. This week we will turn our attention to the new malignant strands of this ideology that persists in plaguing the world today. They too have certainly done a lot of catastrophic damage during the recent years, just as Marxists everywhere always do. Pierre Poilievre is a politician who absolutely understands the severity of the threat of the present-day Marxist all the way down to his bones. His speech in the House of Commons went viral as he stood alone, facing off against power to speak up for the working class. And according to all of the available indicators, he will be the next Prime Minister of Canada. And that could not be better or more welcome news for a nation of good-hearted people who are currently struggling under impossible burdens. It is equally good news for the wider continent, which could have a dazzlingly bright future as a result of the changes that are being embraced by its people on both sides of the border. I wholeheartedly support Poilievre's vision for a Canada that puts Canada first, existing side by side with an America that puts America first. Those priorities are not in any way in conflict with each other. After all, our interests are, and essentially have always been, aligned. Simply put, we are two siblings who share positions at the top of the world order, and both countries will prosper most by having each other's backs as we both head towards a prosperity for both of our people. Together, with both countries under this new leadership, we can create a vast continent that is full of wealth and opportunity, one that is fiercely devoted to freedom, where everyone can enjoy the flourishing that will inevitably follow. We can create a land that will be the envy of the entire world, serving as a beacon of endless possibilities and optimism. We will stand as a bulwark against communist threats like China and their alliances with dictatorships in the Middle East and Russia, not to mention North Korea. The disaster that has befallen Canada under the cataclysmic leadership of Justin Trudeau has crippled the entire nation. The son of a Marxist who admired dictators throughout the world so much that he openly associated with Castro and the Chinese Reds, Justin's idea of leadership has predictably been a massive calamity for his people on so many fronts that it seems almost willfully malicious. He has brought Canada to the brink of socialist collapse. Suicide by doctor is now the 5th leading cause of death there. And a lot of that is due to the abject hopelessness felt by the people. A hopelessness that was produced by Marx's favorite modern son and devoted evangelist, Justin Trudeau. His bill, C-63, is a monument to the kind of freedom-crushing world that this narcissist tried and partially succeeded in building. Under existing laws, Canadians can be stripped of all their freedoms over a post that those in power decide qualifies as wrongthink. They have used the vague category of so-called hate crimes in order to accomplish this. You could be prosecuted for posting something online that someone somewhere finds offensive if those in power decide that it qualifies as hate speech. But Bill C-63 takes those current abuses of power to a completely dystopian level. Under this new bill, a person can be imprisoned in their home for an entire year while they are tracked with an ankle monitor and have all of their visits and communications monitored, and they can even be forced to provide body fluid samples every day. Worst of all, the victims of this truly Orwellian law can be subjected to this kind of treatment for an entire year, even if they've not actually done anything. Under this law, if a malicious person claims that they are afraid that you might eventually post something that might qualify as hate speech, that is all the grounds that are needed for you to be stripped of everything under that pretext. Marxists are dictators, every single one of them. Don't let anyone fool you when it comes to that. Marxists want an extreme degree of control that most people in the West can't begin to comprehend, and they will lie, cheat, and kill in order to get it. Each one of them longs for a world where they will have supreme power, which they can use to force everyone around them to obey any rules that they decide to inflict on their subjects, who will all live completely at their mercy and according to their whims. The pretty ideas that they spout are all lies, nothing more. That is the reality, and it's time for everyone to get an eyeful so that they can finally see what's at stake here. Polyev, on the other hand, rejects all of the fashionable grandiosity of the worldwide vision of Marxist ideology that has currently been embraced by the globalist left in favor of delivering locally on the basics of life for the everyday, hardworking, normal people out there. He rightly believes that the average person is sick and tired of bearing the consequences of this way of thinking in their daily lives, all for someone else's prioritization of their grand globalist vision. People have usually never had a real job in their entire lives. Quote, our answer to that is to bring back the Canadian promise that anyone who works hard gets a great paycheck and a pension that buys them good food and a nice home in a safe neighborhood. That anyone from anywhere can do anything, and people are in charge of their own lives. That's effectively what we want to deliver. I believe that there's something grand about a family that can go on a nice road trip and share stories and build lasting memories that the kids will remember when they're 85 years old. I think those things are grand. And I think the problem we've had in this country, and in all of the countries that have been afflicted by the horrendous utopian wokeism, is that it's been focused on the grandiosity of the leadership, of the egotistical personalities on top, and not the things that are grand and great about the common people. And that is another reason why I think we're doing very well. People are saying, finally, there's someone who's focused on letting me take back control of my own life and create a great future for my family. Like the conservative movement here in the United States, Polyev wants to make Canada's government small and efficient, with the priority on maximizing the personal freedom of its people. Governments can best serve ordinary folks by getting out of the way and simply unleashing a people who are more than capable of creating a thriving society ourselves. After all, we have successfully done that very thing repeatedly throughout the past. Governments didn't create new worlds, economic booms, or times of expansion and prosperity. Hardworking people did. Unlike the Marxists, Polyev has no interest in expanding the already behemoth government of Canada that was constructed under Trudeau for the sole purpose of controlling everything that everyone does, down to what they are allowed to say and think. The Conservatives in Canada, like those in the UK, unfortunately, didn't govern like Conservatives while they were in power. They fell prey to the belief that they needed to move further to the left, which only succeeded in making them virtually indistinguishable from their supposed alternative. They left the people to become hostages of what amounts to a one-party system. As someone who has always had a great deal of affection for Britain from my childhood, it breaks my heart to see the same nation that once stood alone against the Nazis, who fought so courageously and heroically through the unending darkness of the Blitz, now bow the knee without even putting up a fight to the tyranny that has arisen within and which is fast strangling them to death. This once great empire could soon be subject to forms of oppression as backwards as blasphemy laws, under which they will sink back into the Dark Ages, as unthinkable as that very real possibility is. They are losing everything that they are, which is a tragedy that is beyond words, because what Britain is was something to behold. And it is something that is valuable beyond measure. But it seems like their pride and their will to fight on has been completely ground out of them by these Marxists who have been allowed to seize control of the reins of power in that country for so long now. And they have used that power to crush the people of Britain, grinding them firmly under their thumb until it seems like now they have no fight left. There are no words to describe the horror of watching the once proud and great Britain become the living embodiment of Éowyn's warning in The Lord of the Rings, when she said that her greatest fear was, quote, a cage, to stay behind bars until use and old age accept them, and all chance of valor is gone beyond recall or desire. What a truly sad casualty to add to the Marxists' pile of slain corpses. Like Britain, the Marxists in Canada seduced their people into embracing ineffective and environmentally pointless net zero policies that have had massively self-destructive costs. Having fallen prey to that dishonest con, the way was left wide open for Canada to fall into the hands of Justin Trudeau, who has maliciously brought his own country to its knees. Under his leadership, Canada has become the cautionary tale of the entire West, all in the course of his 10 years in office. And it is a tale that must be told and retold until no one can remain blind to the very real dangers facing everyone else that is foolish enough to fall for these poisonous lies dripping with honey. Poilievre is determined to resist any urge to follow in the footsteps of the Liberals by embracing his own fringe radicals, as they did, in an attempt to slightly swell his party's numbers. That tactic is clearly just too destructive in the long run. And for the liberal parties throughout the West, theirs has proven to be a suicidal decision. Quote, the policies are a disaster. And then people wake up and go, oh my God, my taxes are now up. The inflation is out of control. The deficit is spiraling. There's crime on the streets. So does the temptation exist to try and take on the political policies of the socialists in the short term? Sure. But it's one that I will fiercely resist because I know that by the 4th year of my mandate, people would be enraged because their lives would be even worse. Let's take crime for our first example. What happens to the quality of life for the average law-abiding citizen under modern Marxist ideologies? The streets become unsafe. They become victims of crime and the rising costs. And everything in the local shops ends up disappearing behind plate glass. We know that statistically, 1% of criminals commit 65% of the crimes. In Vancouver, they arrested the same 40 offenders 6,000 times in 1 year. Studies show that the best deterrent for crime, even more so than the length of their sentence, is the likelihood of them being convicted, as long as it's not a consequence-free conviction. If you are living under an administration where you are likely to be prosecuted if you break the law, then the petty criminals are deterred. Contrary to what you're told, deterrence does work. And there are studies that prove it. So if you keep the repeat offenders behind bars, crime goes way down because they're responsible for the vast majority of it. The rest of it also disappears because the petty criminals don't feel that the petty rewards are worth the big risk. Take crime under the Biden administration, for example. The man who gunned down an NYPD officer last year had 21 prior arrests before committing that heinous crime. With his record, why was he ever allowed to be on our streets again? Why was he even given the chance to kill someone who had devoted his life to protecting the innocent, law-abiding people around him? There were 13,600 arrests in the subways of New York City in 2023. Those are only the numbers of arrests. That's not counting the incidents where the perpetrators were not apprehended. Of those nearly 14,000 arrests, 124 people were arrested more than 5 times each just during that year, which accounts for well over 600 arrests between them. When their records were examined further, these 124 criminals were found to have had over 7,500 arrests between them over their lifetime so far. That is an average of over 60 arrests per person. And as of this time last year, when I first covered those statistics, they were still walking the streets, being allowed to continue preying on innocent people. And they are probably still free and committing more crimes right now, given the sad state of governance in New York City. People like this are the exact reason why abolishing the 3 strikes rule was quite literally a suicidal move for our society to have made. How many victims would have been saved if these people had never seen the light of day again after they committed their 3rd offense? I'll tell you. At least 7,128 victims, to be exact, would have been spared. And that's not counting the unknown victims of these repeat offenders who became the victims of the crimes that these people were never arrested for. We know statistically that for every crime where the perpetrator is caught, there are multiple crimes that they have committed that they will never be linked to. But even setting that aside, and assuming that each crime had only 1 victim, in order for these 124 criminals to each get a 61st chance, well over 7,000 entirely innocent people were sacrificed to become victims by Marxist politicians who preach that obeying our laws should somehow be an optional proposition for some people. Nearly a third of the perpetrators of New York City's shoplifting epidemic involve just 327 repeat offenders who have been arrested more than 18 times each just during the year 2023. Why aren't these politicians choosing to remove these known repeat offenders permanently from ever having access to more victims and living up to their responsibilities to protect the people who elected them to positions of power? Let's set crime aside for now. What have been the financial results of having a Marxist prime minister for the people of Canada? Every person in Canada will now have to pay $1,500 in order to cover their share of the government's overspending. So for a family of 4, that would be $6,000 that they'll end up having to pay. And that is just to cover how much the Marxists in power like Trudeau went over budget. That doesn't even take into account all of the money that these people have already paid in taxes. And for the record, Canada already has one of the highest tax rates in the world. So their government is taking in plenty of money, more money than ever before. And yet they still refused to stay within that large budget. They have no shame about continuing to squeeze blood from a stone when it comes to their impoverished working class whose lives they've wrecked. And they still went over budget so much that they've stolen another $1,500 from every man, woman, and child in Canada without their consent. Here in the United States, every single one of us now owes over $100,000 apiece, thanks to our politicians' overspending. Every man, woman, and child in America could have purchased a decent home with the money that our government went over budget. That's not counting what we paid in taxes, most of which was flushed down the toilet for the most ludicrous projects and far-left agendas imaginable. Trudeau's government also increased costs for the people of Canada by growing the number of people employed as bureaucrats in that country. He grew the bureaucracy by over 40% during his 10 years in office. And since then, they've all been living like parasites off of the working class. He also dramatically increased the amount of money that the government paid for consultants. They spent $21 billion just on federal consultants. That's 1,400 tax dollars from each Canadian family every year just to pay for seas of consultants so that the bureaucrats, which they also have to pay for, can outsource their work to the most expensive group of employees available for hire. How can Canada be paying for more bureaucrats than ever before, and instead of getting more work done, you actually need to hire more outside help than ever before? And how, after all of that, are the results worse than ever before for the average person living in Canada? That's why the government spending across the West is what it is. And it's also why the bureaucrats in Canada and here in the United States are desperate to stop any cuts to the budget that has been letting them sponge a living off of the people like a bunch of fat cat leeches for decades. Thanks to these radicals, who only care about their vision and what they want and damn the cost to everyone else, Canada was flooded with 1.2 million immigrants during 2023 alone. That is in a country that only has a total of 40 million people living there to begin with. Meaning 1 person out of every 40 just that year, nationwide, was a new immigrant who had only been there for a few months and who hadn't had time to assimilate at all. More than 1 in 40. Per capita, that exceeds even what has been going on here in the United States under Biden's wide-open borders. Of course, that only makes Canada's struggling housing market and their overloaded healthcare system, not to mention the job market, worse for everyone who was already there and already struggling. But do the Marxists care? No. And on top of everything else, the frequency of anti-Semitic attacks that has been going on in Canada have been completely out of control. Between the reckless immigration from outside and the Marxist indoctrination from within, hate crimes are skyrocketing. Jewish Canadians feel completely abandoned by their own government, which is justified because they have been. Canada's immigration policy was so exemplary before Trudeau that immigration wasn't even a controversial issue there. Immigrants got along with each other in Canada. They brought their culture and their memories, but they were expected to check the trauma of their conflicts and their bigotries at the door. Under this new system, foreign conflicts from halfway around the world are now turning into brawls on the streets of Canada. Quote, "We welcome the people who have come from places that have been afflicted by war, as long as they leave the war behind," Poilievre said. Republicans and Democrats in the United States had once used Canada as an example of a well-run immigration system for years. Then both countries went insane under the influence of Marxist ideologues. But now both countries are taking a hard turn back towards sanity. Under Poilievre, Canada will be returning to a nation that welcomes the immigrants who are willing to become Canadian, which is how most people in America see this issue too. You are welcome to come if you want to become a part of America and contribute. And if you're willing to abide by our rules and laws, and that starts by coming into our country legally. Canada used to have a completely successful race-blind society before wokeism. They invented and imported racism into Canada as a part of politics. Now, they have 253% more hate crimes than they used to. Quote, "We have a prime minister who's dedicated to an extremely radical ideology. It is just rehashed socialism that has been discredited again and again and again throughout the ages. And his authoritarian socialism has guided him throughout his entire prime ministership. He believes in a state that controls every aspect of your life, your money, your speech, your thought, controls all of the industries of the country. And every time that has been tried, it is a complete disaster. So there's no mystery involved. It is the same old disastrous outcomes that result from the same old disastrous policies. People feel like they've done everything absolutely right, and their lives are trapped. Young people say, I got an education, I worked nonstop, and I've made the calculation that there is no mathematical path for me to own a house. It's just not possible. In Toronto here, for example, if you take the average income and the average house price, it would take you 29 years to save up for a down payment. For a down payment. Not paying it off. Forget paying it off. So if you're a young woman who's got a biological clock, obviously, do the math. Let's say you're 25. Well, you're going to be in your 50s before you can afford the average house. So how are you ever going to have kids? End quote. By that age, you're supposed to have your house paid off and your kids raised and out of the home. And you are usually starting to think about downsizing in a few more years. You're beginning to plan out how you will use the money from your home for your retirement. Marxists have stripped that entire dream away from their young people and put it out of their reach. Quote, that's the picture of the youth. Then there's the kind of middle-aged people who do have kids already, and they're terrified of the dangers in the streets. I mean, our streets are just being overtaken by drugs and gangsterism and other dangers. They want safety again. And then you have business owners that are saying, there's just no way to continue to compete in Canada. We have to look at moving. And that means the next 200 jobs we create is going to be in Ohio or Florida or some other place than Canada. The good news, though, is that people do now have some hope. They think that things can be turned around. And they have clearly and correctly diagnosed the problem, which is entirely political. There is no physical, geographic reason why Canada should struggle to supply people with great opportunities of home ownership and family formation. In fact, we should be the richest country in the world, and people increasingly know that. And they know that if we make the right, albeit difficult, political decisions, that they will once again be able to do as their parents did, which is to say, get a house, start a family, live in a safe neighborhood, raise their kids with good traditional values. That's another thing that I'm finding, is that a lot of people are really getting back to those values that we were told were unfashionable. Young people today, they want to have families. In fact, the youth were the first to come on board with me. My rallies were overwhelmingly populated with youth, which is not normal for conservatives. And the reason is because in your youth, young people want to have the adventures of their lives. They want to go into the wilderness and earn a living and bring it home, raise kids, have a purpose that's bigger than just short-termism. 20 years ago, the socialists would go to university campuses and say, vote for us and we'll let you be a kid forever. We'll give you free stuff and you'll never have to get a job. And that was very temporarily popular across the Western world. But then young people woke up and realized that this was not a utopia. It was a total dystopia. And that all the things that they really valued and wanted for their lives were impossible when they were being borne down upon by this massive state. They've learned that help is the sunny side of control. And so now our young people are saying, I want to start a business. I want to invent something. I want to create things. I want to become a tradesman. And then when I get good enough at that, I want to hire 5 other tradesmen. And by the time I retire, I want to have 300 employees. And then I want to give that company to my kids. These are the stories that I hear when I go out and about in Canada. And the great news is that we can have all of these things. That's the optimistic message that I have for people. We've got a limitless supply of resources. We're like a cornucopia. The third biggest supply of oil, the fifth biggest supply of natural gas, the biggest supply of uranium, the fifth biggest supply of lithium. We've got not one, not two, not three, but 4 coasts to tidewater. We live next to the biggest military and economic superpower that the world has ever seen. We have a highly educated population and the best system of government in the history of the world, the parliamentary system. Not the best government, but the best system of government. So all these massive advantages, we just need to unleash that potential. No wonder the young people in Canada are so demoralized when they know that all of these advantages are right at their fingertips, all while they're working very hard to pull their fair share, and yet getting anywhere has been put completely out of their reach by a bunch of self-aggrandizing ideologues who are determined to continue chasing after a socialist world order, one that they will rule over with the iron fist of totalitarianism. Canada is the second largest country in the world. They have lots of land and a very small population, the equivalent of the population of California. They have enormous wealth in their natural resources right at their fingertips. With all of this in their favor, why is their housing so expensive? Because of all the micromanaging regulations that have been slapped onto their housing market. The control freaks, in the form of bureaucrats, are ruining life for everybody. Compare the cost of building a home in Canada to the cost of buying a home that already exists. You can add up the costs of the land, the labor to build the home, the materials used, and the profits for the developer in order to get the first number. But when you compare that number to the sales price of the home, the gap that is left is $1.2 million. So if you've already paid for all of those other things, then what could possibly be costing an additional $1 million? The taxes, the permits, the delays in waiting for the permits, the lobbyists, the consultants, the accountants, and the lawyers that the developer has to hire in order to get through all of the bureaucrats' red tape. In Vancouver, the cost of these bureaucrats is twice the amount that it actually costs to build the home. So you pay for the home itself, and then you pay for the home 2 more times in order to pay for the bureaucrats, who are the ones that are making your life so unlivable in the first place. Quote, and to add insult to injury, those tradespeople who build homes can't afford to live in them. So what we need to do is slash the bureaucracy. We just need to get the government out of the way. The same goes for our resource sector. Why is it that we're still importing oil when we've got the world's third biggest supply? Why is it we can't export our natural gas overseas? Japan and Germany practically begged Canada for natural gas, offering them decades-long contracts at lucrative distressed prices because of the severity of their need. In Europe and Asia, they pay 3 to 5 times more for natural gas than we do in North America. That's a lot of profit to be made by us through exporting. And that profit would be guaranteed as an ongoing deal for decades to come. Trudeau said he couldn't justify a business rationale for making that deal. But that's clearly not true. The ugly reality is that he was happy to impoverish the people that he views as his serfs in order to prioritize his own net zero views. Canada has had offers from Japan, Germany, France, Greece, and other countries, but they haven't been allowed to build so much as a single new liquefaction facility in the last 10 years. During that same time in America, even with our increased regulations under the Biden administration, we built 6. The Germans built an import terminal from conception to completion in just 194 days. By comparison, America's own Trudeau, Gavin Newsom, started an infamous high-speed rail project in California that has been going on since 2015. The whole project is only 800 miles long. It was originally supposed to cost $33 billion. And as of a year ago, the estimates were now at $128 billion. 800 miles of rail. And they expect us to believe that their estimates were off by almost $100 billion. And to top it all off, after 10 years and all those billions, they have still only built 119 miles out of the promised 800. The far left socialist politicians' results are right there for everyone to see. And it's time for us to get some figurative tar and feathers and the pitchforks. Canada's cold weather also makes their country ideal for building AI data centers, for which there is already a great need, and one that will only continue to grow. They also have the biggest supply of uranium in the world, all at a quality that is perfect for creating nuclear energy, which is the future. 60% of Ontario is already nuclear powered. And the tech world is desperate for nuclear power. Microsoft just revitalized 3 Mile Island. Facebook is looking into building their own nuclear facility too. Energy is Canada's biggest secret weapon. They have nuclear energy, natural gas, and hydro energy. Canada also has massive mineral deposits in the Ring of Fire of Northern Ontario. There is no reason that Canada should be on its knees. So heed the warning of their bitter story. If socialism run amok can do this to an incredibly wealthy nation in just 10 years, how much playing around do you want to do with this wildfire? And for the record, the environmental argument doesn't hold water as a justification for Canada's current energy policies. A study showed that if Canada cut India's energy projections over the next 20 years in half by selling them natural gas so that they wouldn't be using coal to meet their needs, that alone would reduce the total global emissions by 2.5 billion tons. That's 3 times the amount of the emissions that the entire country of Canada produces. They would literally completely erase their carbon footprint 3 times over by exporting their natural gas. They could already be at net zero and then some. And it would also boost their economy and make life better for their people. If Canada completely ceased to exist, they would only be doing 1/3 as much for the environment as they would be doing by exporting their own natural gas to India. If we would all export energy via oil and natural gas to the countries that are currently burning coal and worse, while the more advanced nations tried to go nuclear, then we'd all be much further along in saving the planet than we are with this current net zero nonsense. And those useless wind farms, and even solar. And we wouldn't have tanking economies as a result either. We could have our cake and eat it too if it weren't for these Marxist zealots and their religious devotion to their own evil ideas that don't even succeed at accomplishing their supposed goals. Then there is the security risks that have been created by Canada's leaders like Trudeau, who have completely upside-down priorities when it comes to their duties towards their own people. Canada only spends 1.3% of its GDP on its defenses, and that wholly insufficient amount also appears to have been grossly mismanaged. As a result, their soldiers are expected to buy their own equipment when it comes to essential gear like helmets. And their retired veterans are offered maid instead of gratitude and some real help. The far-left Marxists in Canada love to pride themselves on their nation's reputation for being well-known lovers of peace. And that's fair enough. Peace is a true blessing that should never be carelessly discarded. But the truth is that Canadians only have the luxurious option of being pacifists because they live in the backyard of the biggest military superpower on earth. Without that, they would likely find that their luxury beliefs wouldn't even be an option on their table. How does the left really think that they would fare alone if Russia decided to start expanding northward over the Arctic? instead of westward into Europe. It is easy to disdain military might until the day that you need it to save your way of life and the people you love enough to die for. The knowledge that the United States would never let that happen, because we wouldn't want Putin as a neighbor, is a safety net for Canada that their Marxists might want to figure out another response to, besides scornful disdain in an unconvincing display of pretended moral superiority that utterly fails to mask the inferiority complex lurking beneath their feudal bravado. Or, one day they might find America claiming some of that moral superiority for themselves by becoming pacifists too, at the very moment that might prove most inconvenient for Canada. So they might want to climb down off their high horses and behave civilly. Canadians used to be the economic equals of Americans, running a little below and occasionally even spiking up above us in economic prosperity. Now the inhabitants of the richest province in Canada, which would be Ontario, are more impoverished than the inhabitants of the poorest state in the United States, which would be Mississippi. It only took 1 decade under this ideology to go from being our financial equals to that, to a country where Quebec just euthanized over 7% of its own population in the course of 1 year. The costs of these ideas are real, and they can be measured in blood. For Marxists and the variations on that ideology, blood is exactly what the costs have always been measured in. For the first 14 years of the new millennia, America was investing more in Canada than Canada was investing in America. So Canada was winning the tug-of-war of capitalism with the greatest capitalist economy that the world has ever seen. And in the last 10 years, $500 billion has left Canada in favor of the United States. And that's in American dollars, which is around $720 billion in Canadian currency. That's about a quarter of Canada's entire economy, which has left for more business-friendly shores. Take note, blue states. Behold your future. In Canada, you pay around 53% in taxes, and that's closer to 20% in places like Texas. Canadian dollars are only worth 69 cents compared to the American dollar. And you could pay well over $1 million for an average house in Canada, or you could come to the United States and get a massive home for about half of that. Where do you think businesses are going to choose to set up shop? Quote, "My grandfather came from Ireland about half a century ago because Ireland was too poor. Well, now Ireland's per capita GDP is twice Canada's. They're now at $100,000 per capita GDP, and Canada's is $50,000. So what did the Irish do? They cut taxes. They shrunk government. Government is only 25% of the economy, 40% here. Made it very tech-friendly. 75% of the Irish economy is free enterprise. And that's why they're cooking with gas. Look at Singapore, Switzerland. Israel, after the 90s, became a startup nation. The recipe book is already written. We know what to do," end quote. We also know what not to do if you've been paying attention to history. But everyone needs to become more skilled at recognizing the red flags when it comes to Marxism. Yes, pun intended. We must spread that information everywhere in Western society so that this cycle quits happening to people who know that they don't want communism but don't know enough about it to recognize it under its new, ever-changing names and shape-shifting disguises. Polyev says that the young people in Canada are working full-time jobs while carrying full course loads. They are working themselves to exhaustion with no light at the end of the tunnel in terms of getting a future in exchange for their sacrifices. Who wouldn't become hopeless and nihilistic in a world where you can do all of the right things and the path still leads to failure? That's Marxist equality out here in the real world for you. Everyone is equally hopeless, equally powerless, equally futureless, equally controlled and oppressed, and equally poor. The Marxist utopia ends in a world that has been rigged against you through pretty ideas that some people refuse to relinquish because they're selfish and self-centered. They continue to insist on having things their way, despite the mountains of evidence that prove that their pretty ideas are empty in the real world, as well as destructive to everyone around them. So, these unreasonable and uncaring people will have to be rendered powerless by a public that has been inoculated against them. That way, they cannot continue to negatively impact the lives of people who know better. We must learn from Canada's fall. Canadians used to be basically as prosperous as Americans were. Now the average Canadian has 60% of the wealth that we have. And their real estate is twice as expensive as ours is. 10 years ago, the New York Times was writing articles that praised Canada for having the most affluent middle class in the world. Now the GDP per capita for Americans is $22,000 higher than the GDP per capita in Canada, which is nearly $32,000 in Canadian currency. And on top of that, because much of our cost of living, such as real estate, is much cheaper in America by about half, our dollars also go a lot further in terms of their buying power. So the financial gap between us is massive now. And the future looks pretty dark for Canada too. This will be a long haul for Canadians to climb out of this hole. Because Canada is in such tight straits, they have no money to make investments in their own future. With such slim profit margins, employers in Canada cannot afford to invest in new machinery or in new technologies. They cannot afford to build new factories and create new jobs, etc. This means that as the years go by, Canada will continue to fall further behind the United States, despite their vast natural resources, unless something changes. Estimates are that they will be repairing the damage that was done over the last decade for at least 3 more. Right now, at best, Canadians can afford to put about half of the amount of money that we do into investments in their future. Unless Polyev can turn Canada around the way that Javier Milei has been able to miraculously revive Argentina's economy into a flourishing success story, for which the Marxists hate him with a passion, then the profits for Americans will continue to grow, and with them will grow the wages for our citizens. But Canada, who is the mirror image of our shared limitless potential, will sink for no other reason than its politicians. And it is the regular people who will pay for the socialists' dreams, as always. You can already see the gap in Canada's productivity as well when compared to the United States. For every hour that the average American works, he or she produces $80 worth of GDP. A Canadian working that same hour is only able to produce $50 worth of GDP because of the differences in the investments that we just discussed. So with all of this dead weight deliberately hung around their necks, they will have to work 60% more hours than we do just to try to catch up as they try to make the same amount of money that we do so that they can buy food and housing, which will still cost them twice as much as we pay as far as the housing market goes. Talk about having the deck stacked against you by elites living in the echo chambers of their ideological ivory towers. This must end. Are we going to let these Marxists keep accruing more victims until the end of time? Their ideologies are why Canada has 2 million people lined up at food banks right now, unable to afford their own food. That's why 80% of their young people can't afford homes. And their quality of life and the things that they can afford to provide for their kids has become a fraction of what their American brothers and sisters can afford. That's what just 10 years of radical socialism has brought them to. That's how dangerous playing with this fire is. And people have got to finally realize that. People have got to radically open their eyes and stop telling themselves the comforting lie that no matter who gets into office, their lives will basically continue on in the same way. It isn't true. In Canada, socialized medicine, which we hear the leftists praise to the heavens here, combined with their unreasonable immigration policies, has resulted in a system where Canadians now have to wait 24 months just to see a doctor, while Toronto and Vancouver have officially been listed as the most unaffordable housing markets in all of North America. Houses in Toronto cost 50% more than they do in Chicago, even though Chicago is far from cheap. And workers in Chicago make 50% more money than the workers in Toronto do. The numbers are similar between Vancouver and Seattle, too. Canadians, based off of the resources that are available to them in their plentiful country, could have all of the same advantages at their disposal that Americans have. But they are making less money than we do by a lot. And everything that they have to buy is also more expensive by a lot. When you divide the total household debt by GDP, Canada has more household debt than its entire economy. Right now, their households have more debt than the Americans did right before the 2008 financial crisis. Their households are the most indebted out of any G7 nation by far. But on the bright side, their government will put them down like dogs if they would like to die rather than live in the dystopia that the compassionate people have created for everyone. That is the unvarnished truth about what compassion means to a socialist. This is all the result of artificial scarcity created by the overregulation imposed by micromanaging narcissistic governments. Their sabotaging leaders then tried to cover up the degree to which their policies had failed by borrowing more money and printing more money, which caused inflation to skyrocket. Inflation is government theft, pure and simple. That needs to be understood so that the thieves stop getting away with their crime. Say you worked hard for dozens of hours and earned $1,000. Rather than the government raising the taxes on that $1,000, which you would notice, they just print some extra money, despite having nothing to back it up with. The resources are the same, but there is more of the money floating around that represents those resources. So each dollar becomes worth less. That makes the $1,000 that you just earned worth less. And this all happens without you ever noticing that your pocket has been picked. So now the $1,000 that you worked hard to earn can only buy you $800 worth of goods. Governments do this in order to cover up the bad results of their own failing policies by stealing from their people in order to make up the difference. Worst of all, this is the exact opposite of a true meritocracy, because the people who suffer the most from inflation are the people who have been the most responsible, the people who had made sacrifices in order to set aside some savings. Quote, inflation is the single most immoral tax for so many reasons. One, it takes from savers and people who are trying to be responsible. That's making it impossible to be responsible, because if you refuse to play the inflation game of borrowing money to buy things you can't afford, someone else inevitably will, and you won't be able to afford anything. So you ultimately have to act irresponsibly. It's like Milton Friedman was asked, what would you do with your money in times of inflation? He said, spend it. The first thing you want to do when inflation is out of control is to make sure that you get rid of this thing that's losing its value, meaning paper money. The second reason it's immoral is it takes from the poor, because the poorest people do not have the ability to buy inflation-proof assets like gold and real estate and fancy watches and art collections and fancy wines and things that go up with and even exceed inflation. So it's a very big wealth transfer from the poor and the working class to the very, very wealthy who can afford to buy up inflation-proof assets. a very small group of people actually get richer. All the socialist policies in practice take and redistribute from the working class to the super wealthy in practice. And I can prove that again and again and again in practice. In practice, all the redistribution that happens in these so-called socialist countries ultimately goes from the working class to the super wealthy. That is the reality. The final reason why it's so immoral is nobody votes on it. The basic principle of our parliamentary system is the government can't tax what Parliament has not voted. No taxation without representation. But no one ever votes to have the money printing happen. So the inflation is adopted secretly. You blame the grocer because grocers are more expensive, or your local gas station because gas is more, or your realtor because housing. When in fact, it was actually the government that bid up all those things with money printing. And you didn't even know about it. It's a silent theft that takes from the poor and gives to the richest people, which is something that Marxists always love to accuse everyone else of doing. And it destroys the working class, and that's why I want to crush inflation. We need a policy that seeks to stop inflation at all costs. We stop the money printing. The money printing is just a means to fund deficit spending. So basically the deficit is the difference between what the government spends and what the government brings in. The debt is just the accumulation of the deficits. So the deficit right now is $62 billion. There are very real present-day consequences for that. By the way, it's 58 times that in the United States right now at $36 trillion. Polyev gave an example of the parents of a friend of his who immigrated from Italy to Canada in 1973. The father worked paving roads and the mother made sandwiches in a senior home. Doing those jobs, they were able to pay off their home, which was only 10 minutes away from Parliament Hill, all in just 7 years. Their grandchildren, however, will have to work 29 years just to get a down payment together, even with their college degrees that their grandparents never had the opportunity to get, along with all the debt that comes along with those degrees. That difference in the quality of life for the working class is the result of their government printing more money than they actually have as a backdoor way of stealing it out of your pocket. The reckless spending that they engage in that necessitates this deception in the first place is the result of governments focusing on funding every insipid idea under the sun instead of producing tangible results and goods that would grow real wealth for their people. It is the result of replacing what works with what sounds good. And it is the result of ignoring the known outcomes of the repeatedly failed experiment conducted over and over by the latest rebranded version of Marxism. The telling thing about these Marxist character is the fact that Canada has always had a socialist party. So a socialist who was honest, an oxymoron I know, would admit what he was and join that party. But Marxists by nature are fundamentally dishonest people. They believe in winning by any means necessary, and deception is their preferred means of gaining power. So Canada's Liberal Party, which was a centralist party for classical liberals, was infiltrated with blatant socialists. Trudeau's group of liberals were these wolves in sheep's clothing. In fact, Trudeau has attacked the Socialist Party, which as a liberal he's supposed to be to the right of, for not being radical enough. And they admit that he is further left as a socialist than even they are. Trudeau's group of Marxists are very much far-left socialists who just called themselves liberals in order to make themselves more palatable because they could not get elected into power honestly. If they had called themselves by the name of their true ideology, then it is likely that they would never have been put into power to begin with. And since power is what they want, they lied. They claimed to be liberals so that they could get people to vote for them. And as soon as they were in power, they dropped all of their disguises, and the people found themselves at the mercy of a fraudulent socialist government, one that they hadn't really chosen. Infiltration is a favorite trick of Marxists, which is exactly why people need to be more familiar with the ideas and not just the names. The names change every day, but the ideologies stay the same. And those are the red flags that you should be tirelessly keeping an eye out for. Quote, all of their agenda is implemented, and people look around and it's a hellscape. We have 1,400 homeless encampments in Ontario, 35 in Halifax. Hate crimes are up 253% in the last 9 years. The military is decimated. Wages are dropping. The list goes on. It is classic for socialists. What they try to do is change their name and move on and try to have everyone forget their past. First they were communists, and then they became socialists, and then they became social democrats, and then they stole the word liberal, and then they ruined that word, so they changed their name to progressives, and then they changed their name to woke, and now they claim they don't want to be called woke anymore. The socialists always try to disown the things that they've done because it's manifestly disastrous. With the collapse of Trudeau's government, similar to what can be seen here in the United States, everyone on the left in both countries is turning on each other, trying to blame anyone that they can scapegoat in order to distance themselves from their own disastrous ideas. They all want to claim, I wasn't a part of the extremism, which is the one good thing about the internet being forever. It's not as easy to memory hole things as it was in the Soviet Union. The fact that we, the people, have definitely decided that we are going to head in the exact opposite direction from them in both nations should not cause us to overlook the stark warnings about exactly how disastrous even a few years of socialist policies can be, even for the most powerful nations on earth. And apparently, the media in Canada works exactly like the legacy media works here. They work for the politicians, not for the people. And that would matter if anyone under the age of 70 still watched them. But they don't. And the Marxist politicians out there right now, who have lost power, can best be described with Rhett Butler's accusation to Scarlett O'Hara. You're like a thief who's not the least bit sorry he stole, but he's terribly, terribly sorry he's going to jail. Quote, the liberal media is all saying, well, surely you wouldn't want to trigger an election during the liberal leadership race. Excuse me. The Canadian people are not obliged. 41 million people are not obliged to wait around while this party sorts out its shit. These guys could have gotten rid of Trudeau a year and a half ago. They knew he was a disaster then. And now they say, well, we're low in the polls, so we have to get rid of him. You didn't care when he was just depriving single mothers of food for their kids, or doubling housing costs, or unleashing crime in neighborhoods across the country. But now you're really concerned about getting rid of him because your poll numbers are down, and you want to keep your jobs. Sorry, that's not a good reason to paralyze the entire country in the face, by the way, of a major negotiation with the incoming U.S. president, who enters with a massive, powerful mandate, and a man who has proven that he can spot weakness from a mile away. So the country should not be forced to wait for the Liberal Party to clean up its own mess. They've had plenty of time to do that. What we need right now is certainty, and the only way that can come is through an election so that the people can decide. End quote. And it's pretty clear what they're going to decide, which is exactly why these narcissists are bickering and grasping for any straw that would allow them to delay. But no one owes them any quarter at this point. Being overly nice just helps them to regroup faster and begin the next cycle of misery all the sooner. In the end, even the powerful Soviet Union fell, so there's no reason why we can't overcome today's Marxists. We have far more at our disposal than the people who fought against that empire of tyranny did. We are not subject to the kinds of extreme consequences that they were. If those poor people could defeat them, then we can. But we must decide once and for all that we will. You can come back from the brink. They did. Canada eventually will. But we shouldn't let it get to the brink ever again. Enough is enough. After all, the people in the former USSR are still suffering through the after effects of what happened there. It is time for this ideology to die once and for all and be scoured from the earth for good. We need to do everything we can to help people really learn about Marx's ideas and all of his many bastard children that are running around in the world today plaguing the West. People need to know what communism really is and what socialism really is and what has happened everywhere that people were foolish enough to unfortunately have tried this. We need to use whatever is available to us, documentaries, books, podcasts, all of it. We need to saturate the culture with information so that these lies can no longer find any fertile ground to grow in. We can do this. We can kill Karl Marx, burn the corpse, and dance on his grave. We can do big things. Helmut Kohl, the Chancellor of Germany, laughed in the face of the man who told them that the Berlin Wall was close to falling. He said that a change like that would take a lot more time. But it fell the very next day. Yes, it took years to bring it down, but bring it down we did. This happened in 1989. It wasn't a lifetime ago. Less than 40 years ago, there was actually a crazy wall that imprisoned a whole European city. Except it was the people who were on the inside of this prison who were the ones that were free, and those on the outside were desperately trying to get in. That was an accepted fact of life at one point. Long-standing ideologies like slavery and segregation have died before, and this one isn't any more permanent than they were. It's time to end Karl Marx's nightmare and stop allowing him to keep spawning new generations under new names that keep adding more corpses to the body count with each generation. They've already got over 100 million dead victims on their hands after over 100 years of trying and retrying their toxic ideas. Marxists are cuckoos in the nest. They are killers who take and hope that you won't see them for who they really are through their innocent-looking disguises. The unfortunate reality is that we live in a world where Marxists come in a variety of stripes. Just like there are many different kinds of big cats in Africa, lions, leopards, cheetahs, there are presently many different kinds of Marxists, and all of them are dangerous killers. Worst of all, they have infiltrated everything. Traditional economic Marxists attacked capitalism, especially the concept of private property. From the start of their very first laboratory in the USSR, this movement was anti-industrial and anti-capitalism. And while modern Marxists are still all of those things, they've taken the original oppressor-oppressed economic ideology and they've applied it to other areas to create new stripes of Marxism. Critical race theory uses this oppressor-oppressed framework to attack white people, whom they label as the oppressors of minority groups. The newest and most radical form of feminism uses the same dynamic to attack men, whom they label as the oppressive patriarchy. You also have those preaching post-colonialism and decolonization, who seek to attack everything that the West ever achieved and erase its very existence. Then we have queer theory, which makes straight people the oppressors of the LGBTQ, cis and heteronormative people the oppressors of trans people, and seeks to dismantle all family structures. Unlike the original Marxists, none of these newer radicals see a need to support their theories with any kind of evidence. Their structural enemies are just ghosts in the ether, but all of these ideologies are linked by their mutual concept of intersectionality. And all of the demoralizing destruction that these various species of Marxists have been allowed to get away with has wreaked an enormous amount of havoc on our society. It is time to get wise to what they really are. They aren't woke. They're Marxists. They say they want a revolution. Let's give them one that they'll never forget. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like and follow, because that helps make these things successful. And I hope you come back next week. Until then, have a good week, my friends.